on the business implications of the climate conference in Paris, COP21. My name is Jonathan Shopley. I'm Managing Director in Natural Capital Partners here in London. And it's been my dubious pleasure to have been involved in a number of these COPs, or Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol. The first one I attended was back in 2002, and we were invited over to help make it carbon neutral, offset all of the emissions. And in the intermediary years, I've been to a number, 8 I think all in all. And over those years, I have to say it was quite a challenging and sometimes depressing experience to be at these COPs. Thousands, literally thousands of people representing 194 nations trying to figure out how to solve or develop an agreement, a global agreement, to manage climate change. But this last COP in Paris was different in so many ways. It was successful, it was well run, and we got a great outcome from all of that effort. I was there as part of an industry delegation for IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, which also is the home for ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which we helped co-found about 7 years ago. We've been invited again to make something smaller than the overall carbon neutral, 2 days of Caring for Climate Business Forum put on by the United Nations Global Compact, and we held a couple of events, a half-day event on getting to zero, a side event, and a carbon finance and business dinner. So that was what kept me busy while I was there. So by way of an agenda, it's very hard to make a judgment on what COP21 in Paris achieved without knowing a little bit of the context, so I'm going to cover that. I'm going to go into the outcome from Paris, what made it special, the implications for business, and then just to wrap up on taking action on getting to zero. One thing I should mention is that I'm going to try and finish a good 5 minutes or more ahead of time. If you have any questions through the presentation, please type them into your screen and press send. We'll collect those and we will get back to them. I'll get back to them at the end of the formal presentation. So, kicking off then, some context. Believe it or not, this whole issue around climate change began in 1890 when Svante Arrhenius, a scientist in Scandinavia, wrote about the greenhouse effect of certain gases, particularly CO2, acting as feathers in a duvet, and gradually over time, if we emitted a lot of CO2, we would heat up the atmosphere. He thought that it would take thousands of years before that became a problem. And then when Ehrlich wrote in the late 1960s his Population Bomb book, which exposed the extent to which we were affecting natural ecosystems through destruction of biodiversity, emissions of CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels, suddenly there was a realization that this problem that Arrhenius had identified was accelerating and in fact becoming a problem. The numbers that I've got on the right of this chart, 2,090 parts per million, is the concentration of CO2 back in Arrhenius's day. And just before the COP in Paris, there was a readout from, I think, NASA's census, which said that the average concentration had now reached 400 parts per million. So a very rapid increase in the concentration of heat-trapping gases. As a result of that rising awareness, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme set up the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they were tasked with understanding from a scientific perspective what was going on with climate. They produced their first report in 1990. There have been 5 all in all. The last one was published last year in order to inform the Paris debate. And an enormous amount of very complex and in some cases uncertain science translated into what I take as the bottom line there. The costs of taking action now are lower than the consequences of allowing ourselves to be subject to the effects of climate change or runaway climate change. So as that scientific thesis became stronger, we came up with the first attempt to get our arms around this issue with the Kyoto Protocol. But let me tell you a bit about the background. The UNFCCC stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was established back in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. And it was a treaty to which I think 195 countries signed. And the goal of the treaty was to stabilize greenhouse gases to prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. But it was just a treaty saying this is what we're going to do. And then the instrument to deliver that outcome was the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 1997, ratified in 2005, and then was in force from 2008 to 2012. It was called its first commitment period. Now, that was a rather flawed first attempt to create a global agreement to control climate. And one of the flaws was this very important point about common but differentiated responsibilities. The fact that the developed nations had for 150 years used up a lot of oil, coal, gas, pumped a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The developing economies hadn't benefited from that and feel very strongly that they should have access to energy to grow their economies and to generate the same amount of wealth. So there's common but differentiated responsibilities split the world into developed and developing countries. And 37 industrialized countries took on a target under the Kyoto Protocol to reduce their emissions by 5% on a 1990 baseline, but left some of the fastest developing nations like China, Nigeria, India, South Africa, Brazil, without targets. So it was flawed in the sense that no matter how much the developed nations reduced their emissions, there were others that were uncapped. Then we got to, of course, the Kyoto Protocol ran from 2008 to 2012. It was decided that in 2009, one of these Conference of the Parties, these annual events, would be held in Copenhagen to develop the next treaty, next agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol. And that, as most of you will know, failed. And in fact, I sort of used the term, it shook, rattled, and rolled. It shook apart because the developed and developing economies couldn't really agree on who should take on targets. The amount of money that developed nations held out as a help to developing nations to get onto a low-carbon trajectory rattled around in a sort of empty tin. It really wasn't very much. And so the whole thing was rolled forward 6 years to the Paris COP. And in the interim, a much reduced Kyoto Protocol carried the can till 2020. So Paris COP in 21, the one that finished just a week ago, was to develop a new deal that would kick in from 2021 when the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol ran out. So during those intermediary 6 years, there's been an incredible amount of hard work that has chipped away at the obstacles. COP15, of course, Copenhagen, we realized that there was a problem. COP17, which was held in Durban in 2011, got all countries to agree that really we had to raise ambition. We couldn't leave out developing economies. We couldn't rely only on developed. Something had to happen. COP18 in 2012, held in Doha, talked about a climate gateway and sort of gave everybody a bit of breathing space by allowing the Kyoto Protocol to extend and hold this problem till 2020. And then we started to get major breakthroughs in Warsaw, when that whole top-down approach that the UNFCCC had done, sort of imposing targets on countries and holding them accountable, was replaced by the sort of rather revolutionary approach. Every country, developed or developing, was invited to submit an INDC, an independent, nationally determined contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Bottom up, nobody telling anybody what to do, but everybody committed to submitting that by, in fact, mid of last year. So, and along the way, filling in some of the gaps, really important work. The Green Climate Fund was set up to help developing economies by raising from developed economies about $100 billion per year by 2020. It already has secured $10 billion and has begun to disperse that. The complex science from those IPCC reports were distilled into a target which said we cannot let the global climate increase average temperatures by more than 2 degrees over pre-fossil fuel days. So it was a target that everybody could get their heads around. Attention brought it to adaptation, because as much as the science was reporting a pending problem, there are already parts of the world, Africa being one, that are subject to the impacts of climate change. So adaptation to that was included. Early thinking about loss and damages, those islands that are gradually going underwater are already having to face the fact that many of their assets are being lost to the ravages of some early stages of climate change. And that got the attention of developed economies because it was decided that loss and damage would be taken care of, but not on a liability. You couldn't sue nations for emitting greenhouse gases. That was a big breakthrough. In Warsaw, there was also the framework for REDD, which stands for Reduced Emissions from Destruction of Rainforests in particular. And forests, although they are, flow over national boundaries and are not industrial gases, chopping them down, destroying biodiversity emits gases, and somewhere between 15 and 20% of the problem is related to forestry. So bringing that into the fold was a very important part of progress. The last COP in Lima, COP20, saw that country set up the Nazca portal, which tracks voluntary activities from sub-national states like California, Quebec, cities, and businesses. And 11,000 voluntary commitments have been tracked on that to date as we got into Paris. And finally, the UNFCCC itself set up Climate Neutral Now, which is a voluntary offsetting mechanism that everybody has been invited to join. So that takes us up to Paris. That's the background. The Paris Agreement has been hailed as a revolutionary evolution. Revolutionary because the process was different, this bottom-up. And really credit needs to be given to France, who hosted this and who chaired the negotiations, for really avoiding all the bear traps and the pitfalls of previous COPs, which saw developing and developed nations sort of fighting with each other, by keeping it transparent and open. The agreement itself, 31 pages, 19 decisions, and then the agreement itself is almost an annex, and that's 12 pages. So what does it do? It builds on and it recognizes the nationally determined contributions as the building blocks. It respects the sovereignty of every nation state, saying nobody will tell you whether you have to or whether you have met your targets, but you will transparently report how well you're doing. It strengthens that 2 degrees Celsius target and says we're going to have to get that, but we should be aiming for 1.5 because the science shows that this is quite a serious problem if we let it go beyond that. It talks about biannual reporting, so every 2 years you have to report your progress against your NDCs, starting in 2023. And then the 5 yearly reviews of those nationally determined contributions with a view that we ratchet those up. The one thing that's very important, and some people who focus on the negative will point out, is that these NDCs, when you add them up, deliver about a third of the reductions we need to stabilize the climate. So we all know that these have to be ratcheted up. But the agreement builds in these 5-year reviews so that they can be strengthened over time. Inclusive, common but differentiated responsibilities, a lot more money flowing to developing countries, a lot of recognition for the important role of forests, adaptation, loss and damage, and human rights of indigenous people who are outside of the industrial economy but still have a role to play. And the ambition to increase climate finance way above 100 billion per year beyond 2020. So this is a map of all of the countries that have submitted nationally determined contributions. You can see that most of the globe is covered. 98.6 global emissions are covered. It's a massive progression from the Kyoto Protocol, which covered less than 37%. 187 NDCs have been submitted. Included in one of those is the 25 nations of the European Union. So a massive contribution to the effort. Peter Bucker, CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, used this term. We're all developing countries now. Developed economies are developing new ways of maintaining wealth and economic growth without relying on fossil fuels, and developing countries are figuring out how to get that wealth without becoming overly dependent on fossil fuels. Carbon markets have been a large part of what our business has focused on over the years, as we've used carbon credits as instruments for offsetting in carbon neutral and other kinds of programs. So it was interesting to see that the last piece of the jigsaw that went into that puzzle almost at the last minute was Article 6, which talked about not carbon markets and carbon credits per se, but talks about the need to stick these national contributions together in some kind of global system. The picture on the right is of lodestone, naturally magnetic stones that attract any metal, magnetic metals. And basically, as nations take on these targets, they need to work together to keep costs down, to support each other in that. And so this Article 6 enables parties to cooperate in meeting their mitigation targets, calls for a framework focused on sustainable development and national accounting so that some developed nations can finance developing nations' efforts, pretty much as we've done through the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol and some of the cap trade and offset systems that have begun to emerge bottom up but become quite regional. So the implications for business of this remarkable revolutionary evolution that is the Paris Agreement. The implications for business. And the way in which I'd like to sort of speak about this or put this into some kind of context is just plot businesses' positions on this 2x2. The vertical axis is strategic demeanor towards climate change. Some companies are very protective of the fact that they've been very much invested in fossil fuel energy. Some are progressive. They're trying to find opportunities in low carbon opportunities. On the horizontal axis, we've got assets that might be very high carbon, like coal-fired power stations, or very low carbon if there are, for example, a cloud-based network that runs off renewable energy. So we have the creators, disruptors, companies that have always seen opportunities in low carbon. Google's distributed energy, Tesla doing lots in renewable energy and storage of renewable energy. We get the progressives like Unilever and GE who've made their transformation and their future strategic growth fully aligned with low carbon opportunities. We get the explorers like Toyota, Munich Re, and Microsoft who really see the risks of not taking action on climate change, but also the opportunities of taking progressive and voluntary positions. And then what I call the sea anchors or the carbon anchors, those, there are three utilities, energy companies here. EDF, low carbon because they're very vested in nuclear power, Exxon very vested in oil, gas, and Enel, an Italian utility that's actually moving into the explorers and trying to move from coal and gas into renewables. Now what we know is that trillions of dollars, actually thousands of trillions of dollars are invested in the capital and IP assets associated with those more on the bottom left-hand side, and that there are billions or thousands of billions of capital in the assets and IP of the disruptors. And what Paris allowed us to do here is those that are trapped in the lower left-hand corner are now got clear signals that they've been calling for from governments to set clear indication of the need to decarbonize. They've got that, so they can change their capital investments from high carbon to low carbon. The disruptors in the top right-hand corner have got all the signals out of the Paris Agreement that allow them to take some comfort that we really are on track towards a transformation of our economy and to invest and grow their disruptive businesses. A slide that I wanted to put in front of you next to put that into even sort of a longer historical perspective is based on work that a Soviet communist did back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Kondratiev was an economist working under the Stalin administration, and he figured out by looking at data related to wages and productivity and whatever. And by the way, this graph is drawn from Alliance, it's basically a rolling 10-year yield on the Standard & Poor 500 to give a sense of economic growth and depressions. And Kondratiev sort of figured out that the capitalist system goes through quite regular 50-year cycles of boom and bust. And the boom and bust is always associated with some disruptive technology. Start off with the steam engine, and railway and steel, electrification, chemicals, automobiles, petrochemicals. We're now in one which is information technology. And we're going into perhaps the sixth Kondratiev cycle, which is going to be driven by a low carbon transformation. By the way, when Stalin found out that Kondratiev wasn't really predicting the demise of capitalism, but just this creative destruction, he took him out and had him shot by a firing squad because he didn't like the message. So in my view, the Paris Agreement is going to play a really critical role in signaling another major industrial transformation from high to low carbon. And those who have invested heavily in carbon assets and those who are not, both see an opportunity to make progressive investments as a result of the agreement. My final slide or two, I'm just going to talk a little bit about getting to zero, because that really was quite a theme of discussions and the wordage in the agreement. The agreement talks about peaking emissions as soon as possible, drawing them down. It also talks about balancing anthropogenic emissions with removal by sinks by the second half of the century. And what that means is that there's a real desire to get to net zero emissions. The concentration of greenhouse gases has already reached a level where we will get warming. It's almost unavoidable. So the leading initiatives that are going on in the background, the Sustainable Development Goals that were launched earlier this year, have climate change and 16 other goals about getting to zero poverty, zero wastage of water, or zero greenhouse gas emissions at their very heart. There are a number of organizations like WWF, CDP, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, that are supporting science-based targets so that companies move away from, well, we'll reduce by 10% or 2% or whatever we can do, to getting glide paths to net zero over many strategic horizons of strategic planning. RE100 is another alliance of companies that said we've got to get to zero fossil fuels and 100% renewable energy. Climate Neutral Now, the UNFCCC's own platform, encouraging people to use carbon offsets as a mechanism to get to net zero now rather than later. And our own carbon neutral protocol, which has gone through its 10th iteration, has been around since about 2002, which is a sort of a framework for companies looking to use the power of net zero as a mechanism to de-risk its business and to get to that state earlier than later. And carbon neutral is something that Microsoft, a client of ours, has been using for a number of years now to get to net zero, and they were awarded a Momentum for Change award by the UNFCCC at Paris. The photograph in the bottom there is of TJ DiCaprio, who leads the Carbon Fee Initiative in Microsoft, with Mark LaCroix, our North American market lead, on her left, and Zubair Zakir, who leads our procurement team here in London, on the right, receiving that award. And it was really an award to recognize Microsoft's leading position in using an internal fee or tax to fund a net zero program through the combined use of internal reductions, offsets, and renewable energy. And that's the new normal. Naomi, there was a book written about This Changes Everything on Climate Change, and it was very much about this changes the whole capitalist system. I think that COP21 changes everything because we are now working within the free market system to internalize the costs of carbon through carbon pricing, by focusing on getting to zero, by encouraging voluntary actions embedded in these national initiatives, making decarbonization a competitive issue for business, and helping them turn words into action. One thing that underpins all of that, one thing, the only thing in my view that the Paris Agreement mandates, is transparency and progress. And I think that's what Microsoft was awarded for, was the transparent way in which they had designed a system to get to net zero a couple of years back and are running that forward. And it's very much my belief, our belief, that that kind of leadership role will become the new normal now that the Paris Agreement is going to be put in place in 2020 to replace the Kyoto Protocol. That brings me to the end of the formal part. So thank you, and I believe we've got a couple of questions coming in, and a few minutes to answer those. I just wanted to point out that there was a pretty rapid run through the Paris Agreement. There are a couple of references on this page here, one from C2ES, one from PwC, and then the third one, the actual agreement, if you want to, once a bedside reading and have a peek at that. So let me just move quickly to the questions that have come in. First one, are emissions from aviation and shipping a major or just removal of a potential roadblock? I think the way I'm going to address that is to say that the emissions from aviation and shipping are not mentioned in the Paris Agreement, much like the emissions from the cement sector or whatever, any particular sector are not. But they are transnational. They do represent quite a large part of global emissions, and the instruments, the market-based instruments that are written into Article 6 that I mentioned, are likely to be used, particularly by aviation and then later on by the maritime industry, to address and get to carbon neutrality in the mid-century basis. We've got a second question, and I believe we've got time for just one more. Who needs to play the biggest role in transitioning to a low-carbon economy post-Paris? And I think that's an interesting and it's a good question. I think that it's hard to say who of all of those actors. I think that arguably nations have done what businesses have asked of them, which is to set out an ambitious path that creates a more or less level playing field and some certainty for business to invest in what it has to offer. And what it has to offer is capital, innovation, and direct action that it takes in its day-to-day operations. So business obviously is going to have to invest in that transformation, but it has got what it needs from governments, in my view. I think that the NGO sector too, there's some amazing initiatives that were showcased in Paris, science-based targets, RE100, the World Business Council's own focus on low-carbon technology and innovation that are playing a very powerful role in shining a light on the science and the consequences of climate change and keeping everybody honest. The whole transparency piece, where everybody gets to see the progress being made by nation states and play a role in judging whether we're doing enough, fast enough, will be critical to the success of the Paris Agreement. I think we are probably out of time. So thank you for those questions. Thank you very much for attending. We've taken a recording of this webinar and it will be available on our website next week. Very much welcome any feedback, and I have on this slide here my email address. If you've got any questions or any points you'd like to debate, it would be great to hear from you. And if any of the work that we are doing in this space is of interest to you and you'd like to speak about that, please also do drop me a line. Thanks again for joining. We're closing the webinar now.